Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jake Harrington. I'm an intelligence fellow in the International Security Program here at CSIS. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Dr. Amy Zegart to discuss her new book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The History and Future of American Intelligence. Dr. Zegart is one of our nation's most distinguished intelligence scholars. She currently serves as the Morris Arnold and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and she's a professor of political science at Stanford University. She's also a senior fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, chair of Stanford's Artificial Intelligence and International Security Steering Committee, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. She previously served on the National Security Council staff during the Clinton administration and served as a foreign policy advisor to the Bush 2000 presidential campaign. In 2020, Dr. Zegart also served as a member of CSIS's Technology and Intelligence Task Force, which delivered over 100 recommendations in its final report, encouraging the IC to modernize the way it innovates and integrates emerging technology into its mission. So Amy, on behalf of all of us at CSIS, thank you for taking the time to join us today, and over to you for your remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Jake, for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank CSIS for putting together that task force. It was an enormously influential experience for me and my thinking, and I am looking forward to having all 100 of those recommendations adopted by the U.S. government. So thanks, everyone, for joining today. I'm going to have some slides, so we're going to go through them. I'll give you the flyby version of some of the most interesting parts to me of the book, and then I look forward to the discussion with all of you after that. So if we could hit the first slide, that would be great, Jake. We'll go to the next one. Okay, this is A Picture is Worth 1,000 Words. I want to start by sharing with you all a story that unfolded as I was finishing this book over July 4th weekend in 2020. It's 2:06 in the morning and a fire erupts in Iran. And the flames are so bright from this fire, they're detected by a weather satellite in space. Now, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization downplays this event. They released this photo that you see in the slide. It looks like a partially burned building, not a terrible amount of damage, pretty minimal amount of damage, judging by the photograph. And it says that the fire involved an industrial shed under construction, called the damage limited. But two people, and I'm sure many of you know them, named David Albright and Fabian Hines, quickly discover a very different picture. Neither one of them works in a U.S. intelligence agency. Neither one of them holds a security clearance. They both are independent researchers using only open source or publicly available information intelligence, or OSINT. And they use commercial satellite imagery and other data. And they quickly conclude within a matter of hours that Tehran is lying about many aspects of this incident. They geolocate the building. And of course, what they discover is it's not an industrial shed under construction. It's a centrifuge assembly facility at Natanz, one of the main locations of Iran's nuclear program. And it's not a small fire or a small incident. It's a large fire, most likely caused by an explosion and possibly the result of sabotage. They go on Twitter, each of them independently. They go on Twitter. By 8 in the morning, the Associated Press is running their analysis. By afternoon, their analysis is in a major story in the New York Times. By evening, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is asked about this analysis, the possibility of sabotage, and whether Israel was responsible. I don't address these issues, Netanyahu replied curtly. All of this transpired in the course of a single business day. All of it involved only open source intelligence, and all of it happened outside the US government. That, in a nutshell, is the world in which we find ourselves, a dramatically different world for intelligence today. And it's just one example. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll show you a different picture of the same facility. This is commercial satellite imagery. The overhead shot, you can see, I hope you can see it on the slide from where you are, damage much more extensive than that ground level shot that the government from Tehran released. And that was commercial satellite imagery that was collected just a few days after the fire. So the upshot of this one example is that spying isn't just for governments anymore. We know, for example, the dramatically increased role in open source intelligence when Russia invaded Ukraine the last time in 2014. The most important intelligence about troop movements didn't come from secrets, it came from selfies, right? Photographs of Russian soldiers that they posted on social media for their family and friends that helpfully had timestamps and Ukrainian highway signs in the background. When the US raided Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, the Pakistani military did not detect our forces coming, but a local IT consultant in Abbottabad did. He heard strange noises outside of his window and he ended up live tweeting the entire operation. So we know emerging technology from cell phones and the internet to AI, quantum computing, and commercial satellites. These and other technologies are profoundly changing politics and economics and societies, but they're also profoundly changing intelligence. And what I argue in the book is this is a moment of reckoning for the intelligence community. It's an adapt or fail moment akin to what we faced after 9/11. Before talking about this new world and why it's this moment of reckoning, I just want to level set for a minute and talk about the old world of intelligence and how it's operated before now. We know that spying's been around forever. It's always been a part of statecraft and war and diplomacy. The oldest surviving intelligence reports were chiseled on tablets 3,000 years ago. We know our founding fathers used intelligence quite a bit to win the Revolutionary War. And Benjamin Franklin even engaged in fake news, literally printing out fake news. He was a printer by trade from his Paris basement to try to convince public opinion and elite opinion in Europe to support the rebel cause. Well, we know intelligence has been around forever. Data suggests that most people don't know much about how the intelligence business works, how it operates. I ended up running national surveys several years ago, and one of them I did in the midst of the Snowden controversy. So the media is saturated with reports about Edward Snowden in 2013, and yet the majority of Americans I found had no idea what the National Security Agency even did for a living. So I asked them a series of questions of some of them were true and some of them were false about hypothetical missions of the National Security Agency. And about 3/4 of Americans got most of those missions wrong. And only half of Americans knew that code breaking and code making, a core mission of NSA, was actually a mission of NSA. So there's not a lot of fact and knowledge about intelligence. I found in Congress, for example, there are more powdered milk experts than there are people who have ever served in an intelligence agency before. The Dairy Caucus has more members because there are more members of Congress that come from dairy states and they need to understand that business to get reelected. But I'll take a minute to beat up on my own profession, which is we professors don't study intelligence very much either. I looked at journal articles in the top 3 political science journals over 15 years, and there were roughly 3,000 of them published after 9/11. Only 5 dealt with intelligence issues. And since professors teach what they know, I discovered that the top universities ranked by US News and World Report don't offer many classes on intelligence. And Jake, if we can hit the next slide, you'll get one of my favorite comparisons. So I asked which U2 is taught in more top 25 universities, a leading question. I found that more of the top 25 offered courses on the history of rock and roll than US intelligence, which means undergraduates today are more likely to learn about U2 the band, not that there's anything wrong with Bono, but then U2 the spy plane. So there's a real education crisis, I think, when it comes to intelligence in this country. So let me move on to the next slide, and I'll just level set a little bit with what is intelligence and what isn't intelligence. And I know many of this audience know this terrain very well, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Intelligence, most simply put, is information that gives policymakers advantage, decision advantage. They can understand what's happening, what the threats and opportunities are faster and better than adversaries. Intelligence is not a crystal ball, though we often talk about intelligence failures as though intelligence should be a crystal ball. It's fragments, not pictures. It's filled with ambiguity, right? Even smoking guns are rarely smoking guns. And the classic example that I often give is during the first Gulf War, when overhead imagery clearly showed Saddam Hussein's tanks massing around the Kuwaiti border. The question wasn't whether they were there. The question was why they were there. And there were differences of opinion in the intelligence community. Some analysts believed that Saddam was readying for attack. Other analysts believed it was a bluff, that it was a negotiating ploy because he was in a negotiation conflict with the Kuwaitis over who controlled the oil revenues and oil rights. So it may be that even Saddam didn't know what Saddam was going to do from one day to the next. And we see this playing out with Russia and Ukraine today. So even smoking guns, evidence of troop movements massing around a border, are not smoking guns. They're more of a Rorschach test. And then, of course, intelligence isn't a crystal ball because adversaries are trying to hide and deceive us from learning the truth about what it is that they're doing. So we tend to have inflated expectations of what intelligence can predict about the future. Intelligence is also not policy. And I've been really interested in, and I've been doing focus groups among students in high school and in college here at Stanford, that many of them think intelligence is policy, and they're surprised to find out that intelligence really is supposed to stop at the policy water's edge, right? Intelligence is an input to policy. Intelligence officials are not supposed to walk into the Oval Office and say, here's the intelligence, and therefore, Mr. President, we recommend you pick option A over option B. It has to be divorced from policy so that the objectivity is maintained. And then finally, intelligence is not just secrets. It's been publicly reported that about 80% of information in a typical intelligence report comes from open intelligence, open source, not secrets, right? So it's not just secrets, so secrets play an important role. So if we can hit the next slide, the natural question that arises and that I hear from my students is, if so much of a typical intelligence report doesn't come from secrets, why do we need the intelligence community in the first place? What can this enormous enterprise do that Google can't? And the answer is really three unique contributions to the policymaking enterprise. And the first is that intelligence, unlike Google, tailors information to a policymaker's needs. Google spits out the same answer for everyone, no matter what their time horizon is. So an example of a policymaker's question or policymaker's need is someone on the battlefield needs to know, is that bridge ahead going to support my tank? And they need to know it now, not a day from now, not a week from now, not a month from now. What are Putin's aims at the upcoming summit? Or in this case, what are Putin's aims today in Ukraine? Policymakers have time-sensitive questions that they need answers to. And then there are long-range questions policymakers need to understand too, like what is the purpose of China's significant expansion of its nuclear arsenal? Or how is the cyber threat landscape changing? How is it likely to change? And what are the implications for the United States and our national security? So tailoring that information to policymakers' needs is a really important differentiator for intelligence. The second is, and we hear this a lot in intelligence, speaking truth to power. And that is answering questions policymakers may not think to ask or may not want to know, right? This is what I call the spinach function of intelligence, right? You may not want to eat it, but it's good for you and you need to have it. And that can be a real challenge, but it's a vital role for intelligence agencies. And then the third unique feature of intelligence compared to other sources of information is tailoring and synthesizing that open source information, which I'm going to talk a lot more about in a minute, with secrets. It's the combination often that really delivers insight, right? And one example of this is, how did the intelligence community know that Russia's election interference efforts in the 2016 presidential election were directed by the Kremlin? It's a declassified intelligence community assessment that made clear the judgment was directed by the Kremlin. Well, public reporting suggests it wasn't just open source information or information that came from public sources, that there was a human source highly placed inside the Russian government. So tailoring that open source with secrets to yield insight. So let me go to the next slide, and we'll turn to why is intelligence so hard in the first place? And I love this example of Donald Rumsfeld's poetry. And he was really criticized when he said this at the time. And some people even set his statement to music, and he got a lot of grief for this, but Rumsfeld was on to something, right? So I'll just quickly, he actually said this in a press conference in 2002, and he said, as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are no known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. Now, what did he mean by this? If we go to the next slide, you'll see what I think Rumsfeld was really talking about. He was harnessing his inner Sherman Kent, one of the founding fathers of the CIA's analytic branch, who wrote an article in the 60s about different types of information and how intelligence really involves all three. And what Kent talked about was, number one, there are indisputable facts, right? These are things that are knowable in the world and things that US intelligence officials also happen to know. So an example of an indisputable fact is, does China have an aircraft carrier? It's something that is a knowable question, and we know the answer. And the answer is yes, China has 2 aircraft carriers, and there's a third one under construction. The second category are things that are knowable, but may not be known to US intelligence or not known to US intelligence yet. So for example, how does a Chinese aircraft carrier perform under various conditions at sea? That's something that's knowable, but we may not know it because in order to get the answer, you have to have someone on board that ship or access to data about how that ship is performing over long periods of time. And that may be hard to get. The third category is the doozy. That's the hard one, right? Things that are not knowable to anyone at all. And here the example would be, how long will the Chinese Communist Party stay in power? That's not knowable even to Xi Jinping. And so intelligence often has to answer that third category of information, things that are not knowable to anyone at all. What will Putin do in Ukraine tomorrow? Putin may not know the answer to that. So that's the old world of intelligence, which is hard enough. And now I want to talk about the new world of intelligence and how it's getting even tougher. And if we can go to the next slide, there we go. So technology is a driver, right? It's not just something that we're using, it's driving profound changes in intelligence. And what I like to call 5 mores. So if we think about the emergence of a whole host of technologies, including biotech and the technologies I mentioned earlier, if we look at the convergence of those technologies, they're really creating 5 distinct but related challenges for intelligence. And I'll go through each of these in a minute, but briefly, more threats to the country, more speed at which those threats move and decisions need to be made, more data to contend with, more customers who need intelligence, and more competitors in the intelligence landscape. Let's move to the next slide, please. On the left is one picture trying to summarize the threat landscape from the Cold War. That's the Soviets parading a missile through Red Square. That was a reference photograph used in the Cuban Missile Crisis, compared to the threat landscape that we face today, a lot more crowded with a lot different types of threats. We know that, in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was priority number 1, number 2, number 3. And today, by contrast, the threat landscape is filled with complexity, velocity, and uncertainty. Cyber is giving old adversaries new tools and unlocking new threats from new actors. For most of US history, 2 things really protected the United States: power and geography, right? The strong, those countries with the strongest militaries were the most secure, and those with good geography, like the United States, with 2 vast oceans separating us from dangerous neighborhoods, provided security. But that's not true in cyberspace. In cyberspace, the most powerful countries, including the United States, are simultaneously the most vulnerable countries because we're so digitally connected. And that's especially true of democracies because our freedom of speech enables the possibility for deception at scale. And of course, the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods in cyberspace are all connected, as we find out when our information is stolen or hacked. So if we can hit the next slide. This gives you a sense that the threat landscape, even within cyber, is changing at a very fast pace. So what a difference a decade makes. In 2007, the Director of National Intelligence, as you probably know, every year the DNI issues a threat assessment. And that threat assessment is delivered to Congress in an open hearing, and you can read it, a declassified version of it online. And so you can look at these threat assessments over time. And what I found is in 2007, that threat assessment did not mention the word cyber once, not once. I think that may be why in that picture, John Negroponte and Bob Mueller are smiling. They haven't really thought about cyber yet. Fast forward 5 years, in 2012, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta delivers a major address where he warns about the potential for a cyber Pearl Harbor. And he envisioned the cyber Pearl Harbor as a cyber attack with physical consequences, the shutdown of transportation systems, for example, targeting critical infrastructure like power grids. Fast forward another 5 years, and boy, the cyber threat landscape looks very different. 2017, the intelligence community assessment that the Russians aren't just hacking machines, they're hacking our minds, trying to sow divisions in our society and influence how people think about issues from racial justice to the presidential election. So all of this transpires in the course of a single decade, from nowhere is cyber on the landscape to a focus on physical attacks, attacking critical infrastructure, to information warfare and influence operations. Next slide, please. This feeds into the second more, which is more speed. So it's not just that the threat landscape is more challenging today, it's moving at much greater velocity today. So if we think about in history, in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, from the time those U-2 photographs captured the imagery, the smoking gun imagery of Soviet nuclear missile installations in Cuba, to the time President Kennedy informed the world of what we were going to do, it took 13 days. Kennedy had the benefit of 13 days to go over the intelligence and decide what his policy response was going to be. On 9/11, President Bush had 13 hours between the time of the terrorist attacks and the time when he had to announce to the country what US policy would be. 13 days, 13 hours. Today, by contrast, with cyber threats, we may have 13 minutes or 13 seconds, or we may be too late between the time intelligence reveals that there's been a massive cyber attack and we have to figure out how to respond. We know that most cyber breaches are detected days, weeks, even months after the adversaries are already inside our systems. And that's true most recently, if we call to mind the SolarWinds hack in December of 2020. So more threats, more speed. If we can go to the next slide, we'll talk about more data. Data, data, data. We live this every day, and the intelligence community does too. Today, there are more people who have cell phones than running water in the world. There are more than half the world is now connected to the internet. In 2019, the World Economic Forum estimated that internet users posted 500 million tweets, sent nearly 300 billion emails, and posted 350 million photos on Facebook every single day. It's just an astounding amount of data. One estimate is the total amount of data on Earth is doubling about every 2 years. And that's just a tremendous challenge for intelligence agencies trying to divine insights from data. So more data. If we can go to the next slide. More customers outside of government who need intelligence to keep the country safe and advance the national interest. What this picture shows is a relatively new development, which is a public service announcement by leaders of different agencies, including General Nakasone, the director of the National Security Agency and commander of Cyber Command. Public service announcement about election security. And we're seeing more of this. And what this suggests is that there are more types of people in the country who need intelligence, who don't have security clearances and don't work in secured government facilities. People like voters who need to be informed of threats to our election. People like tech leaders who are running companies that are both victims of harm and vectors of harm. People like executives in sectors in critical infrastructure that need to better understand what cyber threats could affect them and by extension, the economy and the continuity of our economy in our country. So more people need intelligence. And what that means is the intelligence community needs to produce more in the open. And that's an unusual and unnatural act for intelligence agencies. Who counts as a decision maker today? A much wider array of people who need intelligence. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll hit the fifth more, which is more intelligence competitors. I liken I have a chapter in the book about nuclear threat analysis and the world of open source citizen detectives and what they're doing. And I call this the Star Wars Cantina because it's such a diverse array of people involved in the open source world. And fortunately, some of my friends in the open source world said they liked actually being called members of the Star Wars Cantina. So let me talk a little bit more about what this means. And I think nuclear threat analysis is really one example of what's the changing world of more intelligence competitors. It used to be that collecting and analyzing information required superpower capabilities to launch billion-dollar spy satellites, for example. But now more people can access information and analyze it and uncover what's going on around the world. So the Star Wars Cantina for nuclear threats has a wide range of inhabitants that bring varying degrees of expertise, varying motives, and varying capabilities. And if we'll hit the next slide, I'll share with you two of my favorites. So if you can see the guy wearing the Stanford red shirt at Stanford University is my colleague, Sig Hecker, who's the director emeritus of Los Alamos National Lab and a physicist by training. He's very involved in nuclear threat open source analysis, and he has a number of colleagues here that are doing great work in looking at North Korea and Iran in particular. But this open source community also includes members like the guy on the right, who's named Jacob Bogle. And I copied on the slide right from his website. Jacob Bogle is a rare coin dealer who grew up in Tennessee. So he deals in coins by day, but by night, he's an avid mapper of North Korea. And he's done very detailed maps of North Korea that many in the open source community find incredibly valuable. And I love at the bottom of his website, he says, if you need one of my big three, North Korea, coins, or political consulting, then contact me. Gives you a sense of this open source community. But I took a look more systematically at how does this world differ from the classified world of the intelligence community. And I want to tease out some of those systematic differences for all of you. If we could hit the next slide. And I'm just going to run through this briefly. In the open source intelligence community, people join with a wide range of motives. Some of them are in nonprofits and they need to secure funding in order to keep doing what they're doing. Some of them are just hobbyists that want to pursue these issues because they love them. Some of them make money off of doing it. They're in for-profit businesses that want to be involved in the open source community. So they have a wide range of motives, and they're not all Americans, and they're not all from allied countries either. So it's a growing international ecosystem. Joining the open source intelligence world in nuclear threats is easy. All you need is an internet connection, right? You don't have to have a security clearance, for example. Quality control in the open source world is voluntary and it's ad hoc. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's really not good. There's no penalty for error in the open source world. If somebody gets something wrong, they're not going to lose their job over it. They're not going to lose their security clearance for it. And the open source world can move very fast. Think about David Albright and Fabian Hines working on that Iran industrial shed fire over the course of a single day. That open source world can move very quickly. But compare that to the United States intelligence community. There's a more narrower and unified set of motives, giving decision advantage to policymakers in the United States. In the intelligence community, joining is hard. Right? It's hard to get hired. You have to undergo a security clearance and a background check. Analysts come to the table with a narrower range of backgrounds than they do in the open source world. Quality control is formal and it's not voluntary, right? It's systematic. One of the benefits of bureaucracy is standard operating procedures for quality control. There can be high penalties for error. You can lose your job for error. And this government world moves more slowly, we know, than the open source ecosystem. We can go to the next slide, please. What does this open source ecosystem mean? Well, there are definite benefits to this emerging landscape. And the three principal benefits are, first, more hands on deck, more people who can crowdsource the incredible array of data that we have and identify things like the location or the existence of China's nuclear missile silos, which happened last summer. So more hands on deck can be very helpful. A second key benefit, and this is something that my colleague Sig Hecker has really emphasized, is more shareable information. When open source intelligence is produced, it can be shared within government agencies and across different government agencies and across different communities, and that can be incredibly beneficial. And then the third key benefit is more diverse perspectives. We know in analysis that the more diverse perspectives you bring to bear, the higher the likelihood you're going to end up with better analysis. And we can see sort of the benefit, just a reminder of the benefits of diverse perspectives with the old joke about the glass of water. And the optimist, if we hit the optimist sees a glass is half full, we know that. And we know the pessimist sees the glass as half empty. But the engineer sees the glass as twice as large as it needs to be. That's a sort of shout out to my engineering friends. So diverse perspectives can really be helpful. But there are also significant risks that emerge with this open source world that we now face. If we hit the next slide, I'll go through a few of those risks. The first of the key risks is that errors can go viral and they can distract policymakers and sap resources from intelligence agencies that have to debunk the errors and become verifiers of last resort. This isn't a hypothetical risk. This actually has already occurred. About a decade ago, a former Pentagon strategist was teaching a Georgetown class, and he asked his students to study China's underground tunnels, what's called the massive, the Great Wall underground. And the tunnels were well known, but the question was, what are they for? That had been a question that had been around for a long time. And these Georgetown students spent a lot of time using open source data, and they concluded that the tunnels were probably hiding 3,000 nuclear weapons. That estimate was about 10 times higher than declassified intelligence estimates and international forecasts. Now, that report by these students based on open source intelligence turned out to be dead wrong. It was debunked very quickly by experts across the country. And yet it was still reported by the Washington Post. It sparked a congressional hearing, and it consumed significant time inside the Pentagon. It was circulated among top Defense Department officials, including the Air Force Chief of Staff. So this is a real opportunity cost of error, right? It's consuming the most valuable thing in Washington, which is time. So errors can go viral, and really that could be problematic. The second risk, just very quickly, is deliberate deception. Anybody can play in this world, and they can inject deliberately misleading information to be picked up in the open source community. The third risk is the countermeasure risk. Clever open source nuclear sleuthing can alert adversaries about weaknesses in their own camouflage and concealment techniques that they otherwise wouldn't have known about. And that could make future intelligence collection even more difficult for everybody. And then fourth and finally, crises can become much harder to manage in an open source intelligence world. As third parties fact check what's happening in the real world, it reduces room for compromise and for face-saving or gracious exits and to de-escalate crises. And just to give you a hypothetical to end with, imagine that we saw this fake Twitter. Imagine this fake tweet was real. It's just in. This is a Cuban Missile Crisis in the Twitter age. New at peoplesat.com images show nuke missile sites in Cuba. Hashtag crossing red lines. Well, we know from the real Cuban Missile Crisis that some of the most important ingredients to successful resolution were not openness and speed. It was secrecy and slowness to deliberate. Imagine now that this is playing out today, and now Kennedy doesn't have time to deliberate in secret for 13 days. And if we were to rewind the tape, what would the president have done if he had to decide quickly? He would have ordered an airstrike, we know from the declassified minutes of his deliberations with the ExComm. And that airstrike would have been likely to lead to nuclear war. We know if this happened within the age of Twitter, that suddenly Kennedy and Khrushchev would have been publicly backed into a corner where both of them would have faced increased pressure to look tough. Would nuclear war be more likely or less likely in an age of transparency with open source intelligence? I think there's reason to believe that crisis management would get much more complicated and the risks could go up. Let me end with one more slide about where we go from here. Because I know there's some academics in the group, there are implications for theory, not just practice. For international relations theory, I think this is an exciting moment where there's a lot more work about secrecy and openness and the strategic use of secrecy and openness in international relations. These things, whether you reveal or conceal, aren't just out there. They don't just happen. Better understanding the causes and consequences and the strategic uses of secrecy and openness is a growth industry in theory, and theory that can inform policy. And then in terms of policy or implications for practice, and this comes out of the CSIS task force as well, we need to radically reimagine intelligence to better understand and harness emerging technologies. And the report, the CSIS task force report, talks about some of this too. There are three key levers for change: a strategy that's focused more on technology, how to understand it, how to use it better, organizational reforms in open source, and of course, at the end of the day, it's all about people and having a talent strategy so we get more technologists and others with critical skills in the door. I'm going to stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic overview of the work. And for my own part, I just want to say, in addition to really coherently tackling all of these incredibly complex issues about where intelligence is going, your book is also just a really compelling read. And so I highly recommend it for folks who are either new to intelligence as well as old hands who are trying to make sense of where all of this is going, where the mission's going, how all of these disruptive factors are going to change intelligence in the long term. So I think it's a really important text building that bridge between folks who are new to intelligence, folks who have been around the IC for a long time, and then as well those really important customers that you mentioned as well, the new consumers of intelligence in the private sector and elsewhere who need to become more attuned to what the IC is doing. So again, congratulations on the book and highly recommended. We had a few links there where people can pick it up.
Thank you so much. And I have to just say, Jake, to say that a book is an easy read, a fast read, it just warms my heart. I really appreciate that.
It's real. I honestly, I think it's a really important text for helping all of us understand where we're going. I wanted to start by asking you about open source and this so-called OSINT revolution that we're experiencing right now. I thought Chapter 9 in your book did a great job providing an overview of this world, the data that's available, the diverse groups that are exploiting and analyzing this data. In our recent work here at CSIS, we've urged the IC to explore ways to better leverage these emerging groups. It's not about just getting access and using open source data, but benefiting from the wide range of organizations and individuals who are making sense of this. And you gave us some great examples of the folks who are out there doing great work, as well as some folks who have made some pretty significant errors along the way. One of the things you noted in the text too, and you mentioned during your remarks, is that one of the big concerns about this is that the IC could get bogged down basically in fact checking. As analysts proliferates, the IC is going to be completely focused on just trying to figure out what's true and what's not in that world. And I think even more importantly, looking forward about OSINT, we're still in this period, I think, of significant disruption. We were talking earlier about the situation on the Russia-Ukraine border, and we're seeing a significant role for OSINT in that. And it's an unanswered question as to how that's going to influence behavior in that potential conflict. And then looking forward to the next crises, how OSINT is going to affect state behavior in the long term. So my question for you is, if intelligence is ultimately about hiding and finding, that historical cycle between the hiders and the finders, how's OSINT going to affect this dynamic going forward?
Boy, I wish I had a good answer to that question. It's an excellent question. What we know from history is that whenever there's a new innovation, there's a countermeasure that comes along. So how this is going to play out, I don't think we know fully. But I will say this, since I wrote the book, my thinking has evolved about OSINT. And I think it's important to think about, and you alluded to this, Jake, OSINT isn't just stuff. It's not just information. OSINT is an ecosystem. It's a whole ecosystem of organizations. And so the IC can't go it alone. So part of to answer the question, how do we harness OSINT better? It's how do we work collaboratively with organizations in this community? And how do we encourage them to have better standards, better norms, better training, so that the IC doesn't bear the full burden of quality control. And there are moves in this direction. I have colleagues at the Stanley Foundation that are hosting workshops to try to develop these norms. I have a colleague at Stanford who's teaching OSINT to undergraduates and how to do it well. But I think that's one of the keys moving forward, is how do you harness the ecosystem of organizations, not just the information they provide.
Speaking of norms, but in a different context, one of the big questions looking at the role of technology and data in society and the different approaches that we've seen taken toward the way that data can be exploited for different types of security activities. In your book, you included a really interesting and great quote from George Kennan that I'll summarize, but it was basically that when we look at sort of values versus us and our adversaries, there are certain times when the U.S. may forego a strategic opportunity because it's the right thing to do, where we could do all sorts of things but they would be contrary to our values, and we won't. As we look at sort of the next phase of the way that data is interfacing with society and potentially enabling intelligence operations globally, what are your thoughts on the differences in approaches that the U.S. may take versus China or Russia or other countries? And then in tandem with that, more specifically, there's been a lot of attention to this concept of ubiquitous technical surveillance, which you've mentioned in the text as well, which is that data is so ubiquitous and available that it can be used for all types of targeting activities. How does an intelligence operating in a democracy contend with UTS threats without abandoning their values?
I think, Jake, you've lived this, right? We've always had this tension between secrecy and accountability in democracy, that intelligence in democratic countries works very differently than intelligence in other countries. And so, you look at intelligence services in China and Russia, they're training their efforts on their domestic population, right? And quelling political dissent. We've had chapters, some dark chapters in American history where our intelligence agencies have done that. But the point is, it was against the law, right? And they were reformed as a result of those activities. And in other countries, it's not. So that's one fundamental difference. I think we have to stay true to our values. And there's always a tension between those values and the security needs of the country. And those guardrails, as this technological landscape is changing, are going to be really important. And they're going to include the private sector in a bigger way than they have in the past. I always say Google knows a lot more about me than the National Security Agency does. What kind of guardrails should there be about what big companies can use our data for? Who can they share it with? Who can they sell it to? And what are the potential uses of the data that no one saw coming? So we need to think much harder about guardrails about our data privacy, not just for privacy's sake, although that's important, but also from a national security standpoint. With respect to how is this competition going to play out with techno-authoritarian regimes like Xi Jinping's regime in China. I am concerned. We talk about wanting a free and open internet. Well, the internet is only free and open for our adversaries. They can get all sorts of information about us while trying to deny information to their own citizens as well as to foreign governments inside their countries. We can see this right now with the Beijing Olympics, the burner phone Olympics. This is really disconcerting on so many levels, but that's the reality in which we're going to be operating. And I think any move forward for the United States, we're going to have to be true to our values and find a way to reconcile that the bedrock values of our democratic principles with a need to get smart and adaptable at dealing with these foreign threats.
I've got a question here from one of our audience members. You mentioned that one of the distinct attributes of the IC is that it does not recommend policy. IC members would argue that we present information without an agenda or ideological motive, as a business or an NGO might. We, the question asker, often see this as a positive attribute, but does this perspective also have disadvantages that may require the IC to question its objectivity or integrate more with policy offices?
So I really appreciate that question. I think the bigger challenge for the IC is not so much objectivity or subjectivity. It's how do we combat cognitive biases that we all share. So I think endeavoring to be objective and to be apolitical is essential. It will always be essential for intelligence. You don't want your intelligence agencies to have a dog in the policy fight, because that will color what they do and it will render their judgments less credible. But there are enduring challenges, cognitive biases that make what is objective or what is ground truth hard to uncover. So, we're in Super Bowl season, so I think a lot about optimism bias is one of the classic biases that we all confront. I still think the Niners are going to win the Super Bowl. But intelligence officials confront all of those same cognitive biases. So optimism bias explains in part why we were surprised by China's entry into the Korean War. So I know the IC is very well aware of these biases, but we need to do more training, and it's a constant fight to help individuals and groups really confront the cognitive biases that lead us all astray.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Chapter 5 as a former analyst myself, on analytic tradecraft and cognitive biases, and particularly the emphasis on it's a constant effort to check your assumptions, check your biases, and continue to be aware of them and work through them, and some of the tricks of the trade that you learn over time to work through the knowledge that your mind and your brain will fail you along the way. Speaking of sort of the relationship between intelligence and policy, I'm curious your thoughts on how we talked about how the pace of threats is moving so rapidly. You talked about 13 days to 13 hours to 13 seconds, or missing that decision window. What impact does that have on the way that intelligence and policy should interact? I always go back to the quote from Roberta Wohlstetter, which is that there's the relationship between warning and decision is very interdependent and inescapable, close relationship between those two things, which suggests that intelligence and policy should be constantly working together. But as you noted in your work, and it's really important to ensure, is that there is a line where intelligence stops and policy begins. Are there new ways to think about how that relationship should work in the context of this type of environment that you described?
Absolutely. And so you think about the pace of provision of intelligence for decisions, right? I mean, I'm always struck by the fact that, we can see things happening in real time on Twitter, and yet, it's really hard to get access to that kind of constant stream of information on the classified side. So several years ago, I went to STRATCOM, Strategic Command, and went into the underground operations center for managing nuclear crises. And I was really curious, and I asked our hosts, do you have Twitter down here? And they said, actually, we do. And sure enough, on the big screens, right, there's a Twitter feed, and then there's a classified feed, which tells you how much the outside world, the unclassified world, is pushing the pace of information. And so that integration of intelligence and policies got to get tighter, and it's got to get more seamless. And as you suggest, Jake, that poses some challenges, because again, we don't want intelligence to get into policy, and we want intelligence to be thoughtful and considered and vetted. but there are going to be increasing pressures to speed up that process because policymakers need information much faster.
What do you think the public perceptions are of OSINT? Those of us who study it look at sort of its potential utility, and there isn't really a right answer, but it has the possibility to complement IC capabilities where collection in OSINT can mirror potentially other collection capabilities that makes that data more usable. We've talked a little bit about analysts being a force multiplier for the broader IC analytic cadre and bringing new, diverse insights to the table. What do you think the public's view is on that? So if it's, is there a sense that an OSINT discovery is made and reported widely that it's somehow suggesting that the IC missed this development? And then how do policymakers manage that, where they're dealing with this dilemma where something is disclosed that that may already be known, but was done sort of outside of the traditional channels that we're used to working through? I think it's all part of this idea that we are in this disruptive transition between that old era that you described and the new one that we're sort of muddling through now.
So I wish I had public opinion data that I could answer that question, what does the public think about OSINT, in a more systematic way. So I'll give you anecdotal data. So take it for what it's worth, which is that I think right now there's kind of a breathy optimism about OSINT that we see playing out in the press. There was a cover story in The Economist over the summer about the wonders of OSINT. We see a lot about Bellingcat and its incredible successes, not to take anything away from Bellingcat. But we're in a moment of real exuberance and optimism about OSINT. And I think some of that is warranted, but I think there's also not enough attention paid to the downside risks of this emerging world. And you've alluded to one of them, which is, what if OSINT comes up with information that the intelligence community has already known for a long time? And how much time is going to be spent spinning wheels in policy circles saying, yes, we knew that all along, we really did. And what does that mean for the credibility, the public credibility of intelligence agencies who can't say how they knew it all along, because that might reveal sources and methods. So it's possible that there will be a sort of credibility challenge as OSINT moves along. But right now, I think I'm more concerned that there's a lot of optimism about these capabilities, and it's well served. But we need to pay attention to the pitfalls of these capabilities as well, because as I write, promise and peril always ride shotgun with any new technology.
In addition to OSINT, one of the other things that we've seen become more of a focus in both the British intelligence community as well as the U.S. intelligence community are senior leaders coming out and talking about the importance of new transparency. So the chief of MI6 recently made his first public comments and had a quote that I've really enjoyed using in our work, is that it's this idea that for the British Secret Intelligence Service to stay secret, they must become more open. And he's talking about collaborating with technology industry, but I think there's a much broader application for that idea that that secret intelligence services in this new world need to become more transparent and open with their constituents. And then we've just in the last week or two seen DNI Haynes herself talk about the challenge of overclassification in the IC and the need to declassify more data. What role do you see, sort of aside from what we've talked about with OSINT and things like geospatial intelligence and social media, what role will the ICs, the actual intelligence communities, play in sort of becoming more open and transparent, whether that's declassifying data or releasing open source information on their own? And how do you think that interfaces with public perceptions about the intelligence mission?
I think this move toward being more open to be more secret or to be more effective in your secret world is crucial, right? I think DNI Haynes' speech is a really important speech. We know, and the folks in the policy world and the intelligence world know, that there's far too much classification, nonsensical classification, and it hurts the sharing of information. All those compartments mean that pieces of intelligence are marooned in different bureaucracies. So we've seen this movie before and it doesn't end well, right? That's what explains a lot of Pearl Harbor. That's what was largely working that prevented us from stopping 9/11. So we know that overclassification can be a real problem, but there's something else that's going on here too, which is public trust. For the public to trust our secret agencies, they have to know something about them, not everything, not sources and methods, but they have to know what it is that they do. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was when I polled my students back when I was teaching at UCLA, I found that they got most of their information, and it was wrong, from spy-themed entertainment, right? So there are lots of myths about the intelligence community floating around, and it's because we are awash in spy-themed entertainment, and there aren't many places for spy facts to come to light. So, you look at the number of movies produced by Hollywood, blockbuster spy-themed movies, has doubled since the 1980s. And what do these spy-themed shows convey? Well, the typical sort of myths that they convey are, number one, that intelligence agencies are running rogue. Jason Bourne is being chased by rogue CIA agents on the streets of New York. Number two, that torture always works. And number three, that there's a techno surveillance state that is listening to your phone calls with your grandmother. And none of those things are true. And so I do think that this is a real crisis, not just, I talked earlier about how universities aren't teaching much about intelligence, but the intelligence community has to be more forthcoming about who they are, what their values are, and how they operate. I'll just share a quick anecdote to send this point home. I had folks from the CIA come and do a simulation years ago for my students, and it was an amazing simulation. When they came to campus, and it was an outreach effort, the public affairs officer would not tell me his last name and would not give me a business card. This is the person in charge of public outreach, right? We have to do better. The intelligence community has to be more forward-leaning about engaging more with the public to demystify what it does and to counter the myth narrative from our entertainment.
That actually aligns with a question that we also received from the audience, is a question about how is that vision of that transparency and open sort of dialogue with the American public possible in an environment that's so politically polarized?
Hope springs eternal. I would like to think that it is. I think it's notable that in 2014, the CIA actually created a Twitter account. That I start the book with this, my discovery of the CIA's Twitter account, which wonderful first tweet, one of my all-time favorite tweets, which was, "We can neither confirm nor deny that this is our first tweet," which which is a lighthearted moment. But I think intelligence agencies have no choice but to become more engaged with the public. And I think the more that the public hears from them and sees how they operate, again, not fully transparent, but more open, more engaged, the more it will be clear that they're not political.
And certainly not scientific, but I know, Director Wray in his recent remarks was talking about how special agent applications for the FBI had tripled in the last few years, suggesting that there's at least significant and growing interest in people joining agencies. My last my last question for you is going back to Chapter 2, and we mentioned it again about fictional depictions of spycraft. Are there any that you like or recommend?
So I like spy-themed entertainment. I don't want people to think I'm a Debbie Downer and I never watch entertainment or think fake plot lines are fun. I do. The one movie that I like, and I think it hews close to reality, though the ending doesn't, is Argo. It's a great story. It's a real story. And I think it's really well done. But I don't want people to think I never like the movies, but I do think there are negative effects of our entertainment world that creative folks in Hollywood haven't fully thought through.
Yes, and I think that completely aligns to the idea that you do a great job in the book, also just laying out the specific impact that in a vacuum of actual facts about the mission and the work of the IC, that it leads to policy decisions being made on fiction, which actually is a real thing that you demonstrate. So as we're running out of time, I won't have time for myself to talk about my favorite John le Carré novels or what influence it's had on my career in looking at intelligence issues. But
we should do another event just on that, Jake.
I'm working on that. That's going to be hopefully a focus of a future project. We can swap stories about our favorite spy-themed entertainment. But Amy, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for everything you've done in writing this and everything you've done working with CSIS over the years. So good luck on the rest of your book tour, and thank you so much again.
Thanks so much for having me, Jake. It was a delight.